fishing, it's in my soul.
Welcome to the Salt Strong Podcast, disrupting fishing entertainment as you know it. Prepare to laugh. Prepare to get to know fishing legends in a whole new and unfiltered way. And on occasion, you might even learn a thing or two about fishing. Here's your host, Joe Simons. Like diamonds.
What's up, Salt Strong Nation? Joe Simons, like diamonds. If you want to catch inshore slams, redfish, speckled trout, snook, flounder faster than ever before in the winter, this is the best podcast content we've ever done on it. Wyatt and Tony got together and basically just laid out everything. I mean, starting with the spots, because obviously that's the most important. So the majority of this podcast is all about finding the most perfect spots to catch slams, especially redfish and trout. Like super, super easy. Like they've literally made it easier than ever to go out there and be in the right spot at the right time. So part two is they start talking about time, the tides and the time of day, and then start talking about lures and rigging. So if you want to go out there and catch more redfish and speckled trout, especially anywhere from Texas to Florida to the Carolinas, this is going to be the podcast for you. Here's Tony and here's Wyatt. Enjoy.
What's going on, Salt Strong Nation? It is Wyatt Parcell and Tony Acevedo, Salt Strong Fishing Coaches, here to talk to you guys today about how winter weather patterns are going to affect inshore fishing, regardless of where you live. We're going to be giving a lot of great tips today, how different fronts affect fish, the best spots to find them, tackle, retrieve, literally everything you need to know about winter weather fishing. So first thing we're probably going to go over, just kind of cut right into the chase of it, is the number one type of spot to be looking at. And then we're going to talk about some fronts afterwards and how, each of those different fronts are going to affect the conditions around fishing this type of spot. But really, regardless of where you live, this type of spot is going to be, productive in Florida, Texas, the Carolinas. On paper, this is conceptually the same spot. On satellite images, it might look a little bit different, but you'll see what we're talking about here in a second. I'm going to actually let Tony describe the spot because Tony's fished these much longer than I have, and he's very familiar with fishing around cold front, so he can probably give a better explanation of the number one type of spot to be fishing in these winter weather patterns.
Yeah, so you hit it nail right on the head. I mean, the type of spot is going to be very similar from state to state, because the first thing you want to look at is what's going on underneath the water. You want to look for an area that has a quick depth change. And what I mean by that is, let's say it could be a shoreline up near a flat. You have a shoreline, then it drops down. You can have a flat where you have shallow water and then it drops down quickly. And that depth change, it doesn't have to be, depending on where you live, it doesn't have to be, a 5, 10, 15-foot depth change. It could just be a gradual, 3 to 4, maybe 5-foot depth change, because the water temperature is going to be a little bit different from that deep water to that shallow water. And let's say you live in like the coastal marsh areas. I know, Wyatt, you lived up in North Carolina for a while. And like when you have a creek mouth or you have a turn or a bend in a creek, you're going to have a good depth change there. So those quick depth changes, that's what you want to target, because those fish, they're going to be sitting in those deeper pockets when it's cold. So overnight, after a cold front comes through, they're going to be pushed down deeper. And then later in the day, later in the week, possibly even, those fish will start gradually pushing up to those shallow areas. And in addition to that depth change, you want to find those areas that are wind protected. So you want to find really those two main things: quick depth change and wind protection. And if you can find those areas in the wintertime, even, late fall and early spring, because you still have cold fronts coming through, those are the types of spots I'd be looking for.
Gotcha. So let's just go ahead and run through 3 different states real fast and kind of give an example of what those types of spots would look like. And we can see basically on paper that they are the pretty much exact same type of spot. Quick depth change with wind protection close to structure. Now, as you said, I live in North Carolina. An example of this type of spot, again, would be a creek mouth, like Tony mentioned. I would prefer the ones that are right on the edges of those flats, where that negative tide that we get in the wintertime, because all those north winds are pushing that water south. on the edges of those flats that we know are going to dry up. Those fish pull off those flats. They sit in those depth changes close to those creek mouths that already have a lot of sediment that's been displaced by the current, specifically the ones that are going to have oyster bar points on them, just because there's a lot of crustaceans that hang near those points, redfish, trout, flounder. If there's inshore predators, they're going to gravitate towards that bait. And those are just really the areas in coastal marshes, the Carolinas, Georgia, that even Virginia, that I really see the most productive type of zones. In Texas, it's going to be a similar situation. I'm going to let Tony describe what a Florida example would look like. But Texas, I would assume, would be similar. It just seems like the edges coming off of the intercoastal waterways where it enters the grass flats, where there's just been a good displacement of sediment from current flow or just wind-driven current that's created a slightly deeper cut. And I've also found that the dolphins that are running the intercoastal channels are also going to force those fish out of the really, really deep zones and into just those cuts that border those flats, specifically the flats that have a lot of seagrass on them. And if you can combine that again with an oyster bar that's close to one of those cuts, really, really productive zone. So what would this type of spot look like in your area of the of fishing grounds in Mosquito Lagoon or the east coast of Florida?
Yeah, so the type of spots you just talked about, that pretty much holds true from, I would say, about the St. Augustine area in Florida all the way up to like Virginia, because the coastline is very similar from there on up. And then when you get into, let's say, Volusia County, Mosquito Lagoon and Central Florida, that's where you get more into the flats fishing. Also, bridge fishing is really good in the wintertime. So an ideal spot for me is going to be close to a bridge, because the causeways and the bridges in my area, the way they make those bridges is they have to dredge up sand and mud from the actual river to build up the causeway to put the road on top of. So that's an area where there's going to be a nice quick depth change. So those fish can quickly go from, that deep water to that shallow water. Also, if you look at the river systems over here, they run north to south. When we have a cold front that comes through, those bridges provide great wind protection from that northeast or northwest wind. So you're going to, again, have those things that you're looking for: wind protection and a quick depth change. And later in the day is also going to be the more ideal time to fish. We'll go into that a little bit more in depth a little bit later into this. But that's what I would be looking for. And over on the West Coast, it seems like docks seem to be a really good target, just because you have that current over here. On the east coast of Florida, we don't have much current flow in Mosquito Lagoon, North Indian River, and the Banana River. It's all wind driven. So docks, to me, don't produce as well as like the natural structure and the natural depth changes. On the West Coast, docks seem to be really good because you have, pretty much a quick depth change from the dock, the end of the dock, up to the shoreline. And those fish can hold in those holes. The docks provide holes because the boats have to have deep water to go up to the docks. So those make really good spots. But not to say docks won't be productive on the East Coast. When you get closer to the inlets on the East Coast, that's when docks can be more productive.
Gotcha. Yeah. And for anyone listening to this right now, we are going to have some images that we're going to put on the blog post at saltstrong.com to give some examples of this. But these are the types of areas that we do break down in on the water reports and weekly spot sections in the insider community for our insiders. So be sure to check those out as well. But we're going to move now into how fish are going to behave in the 3 stages of winter weather fronts. Now, what we have is pre-front. So this is right before those really cold temperatures come through. Then you've got fishing during the front. So, those high winds are kicking, the temperature's still pretty low. And then post-front. So that front has broken. It's starting to warm up a little. Sometimes it's a mild warm up, and other times, it cuts straight into some really sunny, calm days. And those are actually 2 different really types of fishing. We'll discuss that later on. But first, we're going to talk about pre-front fishing. Now, in the wintertime, this is when I really, really like to fish, just because I find that those fish are sensing the pressure is changing. They feel that that cold front is about to come through, and they know that they're going to have to hunker down, and they're not going to be able to feed as well as they did in the days prior, or the days leading up to that front. So I find that fish will move up into the shallows, where there is really the most prime hunting opportunities for small shrimp, bait fish, things of that nature. And they're going to be looking for really high calorie meals. Now, as they get up in the shallows pre-front, usually it's still kind of warm, so they have a little bit more energy than you would expect most fish to have in the wintertime. This is usually when it's warmest, is pre-front, unless you're fishing really sunny days. Post-front, we'll talk about that again in a second. But these fish are really aggressive. So when I'm fishing pre-front, usually I'm throwing a lot of surge baits. I will upsize a little bit, sometimes up to 4-inch paddle tails. But usually in the wintertime, I'm not using anything more than a 3.5 to 4-inch bait fish imitation. But that's usually my go-to bait pre-front, because I know those fish are actively searching for a high calorie meal. I'm going to be fishing a little bit faster than I would on your average winter day, because those fish are willing to chase down bait because they know they're not going to get too many feeding opportunities once that front does hit. But I do find that, again, when we're talking about this number one type of spot, those fish, again, are sliding up a little bit past where that depth change kind of starts to shallow up. So I would say within about 100 yards of that depth change, those fish are actively hunting around and feeding. They're not actually feeding right in the depth change itself. Sometimes they are feeding on the edge. Other times they are, within that 100-yard range in the seagrass, potholes, things of that nature. If you're fishing those creek mouths in the coastal marshes, they will slide up onto some of the shallower sandbars, or they'll push up against the grass, because they're just really looking for whatever high calorie meals they can find. So don't be afraid to fish a little bit shallower, but don't go too far away from that depth change, because that's the main piece of structure that they're relating to. So you can rule out fishing most of a flat and really focus your efforts within that 100-yard range, at least in my experience, to wherever that depth change is. So Tony, in terms of, feeding activity, the tackle, where these fish are holding, how are you fishing pre-front?
So it's very similar. I mean, pre-front, it will depend on, when the last cold front came through. Because let's say you have a cold front slide through on, let's say, a Friday or Saturday, and then the next one doesn't come through until that following Friday or Saturday. That Thursday before, that's going to be the best bite, because that water has had a chance to warm up. Those fish have enough time to get acclimated, and they're going to be more willing to cooperate, more willing to eat, because number one, it's warmer, and also they know something else is coming through. They can sense that pressure change. They got to eat. And then, if you have a cold front back to back, let's say a cold front comes through on a Friday or Saturday, and then on a Tuesday or a Monday, another cold front slides through. That pre-front bite is going to be a lot slower than it would be when you don't have that, bigger gap in time where those fish can become more acclimated. But in general, those fish are going to be pre-front. They're going to be more aggressive, more willing to cooperate. And time of day really is very similar all throughout, either pre-front, during front, or after a cold front comes through. Time of day is going to be really important as far as getting on fish. Sleep in, fish later in the day. The only bad thing is that sometimes later in the day, the winds pick up. And again, that's why you want to look for wind protection. But I would be looking up in the shallows later in the day, pre-front for sure.
Yeah, those are definitely some good points. I guess a good way to think about how these fronts come through in the wintertime is just imagine a circle, because these fronts constantly are rotating through. So, that post front, after that front's come through, a couple days after that, it turns into the pre-front, because there's obviously another front that's about to kind of come through again. But in the middle of these fronts, you're fishing during the front. So that's what we're going to talk about now. In terms of feeding patterns, activity levels, I find this is when the fish are most lethargic. This is like textbook winter fishing. When it's super cold, the wind is cranking, those fish are not very active. That's not to say that you can't catch fish in this time frame. And I actually have caught some really good specimens, redfish and trout that do get really active, even some of the larger ones during the middle of a front when it's really nasty. The reason for this, again, those winds are going to create more negative tides. I do find that I prefer to fish outgoing tides during the fronts, because there's warmer water that is getting pulled out of those shallows into that depth change. So it does invigorate the fish a little bit. It's probably the only little bit of warmth that they're going to get during that front is that water that is possibly being warmed up in the shallows. And when that comes out, the bait's coming with it. If it is that good, really wind that's cranking through, there's going to be the negative tide that's going to pull even more bait out. So that is your best scenario, I find, is wait for that outgoing tide during the front, when it's going to bring all the bait, a little bit of warmer water right through that depth change. That's when I find that the fish will feed, but I'm still taking it really, really slow. This is usually when I'll tie on my gulp shrimp, my power prawns, those crustacean patterns that I can really hang in the strike zone a little bit more with. I'll even break out some mirror lures if I feel like the bait fish patterns are a little bit more prevalent, or I'll fish my slam shadies a little bit slower on some 1/4 ounce jig heads. This is, the time of twitch pause. I can't think of a different retrieve that I use during fronts, just because it just allows your bait to have action, but also give fish the opportunity that they need to strike. And again, in terms of where these fish are holding, they're at the deepest part of these depth changes that we've talked about them a lot relating to, because that's where the most stable temperatures are. If they were up in the shallows or they were hanging near the edges, that wind and those temperature changes are just so variable, and that's going to mess with a fish's metabolism. If they hang in the most stable temperatures at the deepest part of those holes, that is where they're going to regulate their metabolism, their temperature best, because again, fish are cold-blooded. If their metabolism speeds up too much and they don't have the energy to eat during, these cold fronts that are coming through, their bodies are going to start eating themselves. So they need to be able to regulate that metabolism by hanging in stable temperatures. And that's why you find them sitting at the very bottom of these holes, where that temperature does not fluctuate a whole lot, right in the middle of a front. Now, pre and post front, that's very much more dependent on what the weather's doing that day, as Tony talked about, in the time of day. But one thing you can pretty much be sure on: when it's cold, wind's cranking, those fish are sitting at the bottom of that hole, conserving their energy and really just taking their time to get whatever feeding opportunities that they can take.
Yeah, and that time during a front, as the front's coming through, and even the day after, if the bite's really tough, there's a good chance those fish won't feed for another day or two. They don't have to. And going back to their metabolism, when the water temperatures are cold, their body temperature is cold, they don't have to eat a lot because their metabolism has slowed way down. They eat something the day before, they can go 2 or 3 days without even wanting to look at a meal. So if you're not getting a bite, during a cold front or a day after, most likely those fish aren't feeding. And what I prefer to do on days where it's really tough like that, even in the summertime, the extreme heat of summer, extreme cold of winter, very similar approach is to use a big chunk of cut bait. Cut bait works great for snook. It works great for redfish. Trout will even take cut bait. I've seen people catch them on popping corks with cut bait. So cut bait is prime time in the wintertime when it's very cold out, strong cold front. Fish those deeper areas, the edges of the flats, edges of channels, canals can be really good to find those fish. Just soak a piece of meat on the bottom, and that's irresistible to a fish that's swimming by and picks up on that scent.
Yeah, those are some great tips. So now I guess we'll move into to post front. So we've gone through these really high winds, those really cold temperatures, and now it's starting to warm up. The front has broken, the winds have died down. And this is really, we talked about this earlier, there's 2 routes that this can go. It can be a gradual break in the front, or it can be an absolute slam, starts warming up immediately. I don't find that one is necessarily better than the other. It's really just more going to affect where those fish are feeding, how drastic that change in temperature is going to be. But the fact that it's warming up, period, and that pressure is changing does signal to those fish, okay, it's time to start feeding again. It's time to move a little bit shallower, get some better hunting opportunities. And generally, they're going to have a little bit more energy because that temperature is kicking up. So their metabolism is going to ramp up a little bit. So you will find that they're going to start feeding again a little bit more like they did pre-front, not as heavily right after the front, but as Tony talked about this, and as I did, it's a big circle. So as you get further away from the actual front itself, when it was really cold and windy, that activity level starts to kind of tick up. So I guess first what we'll talk about is just that gradual change. I find that, when the wind doesn't die down too much, and it's still a little bit cold, but it is starting to warm up, those fish definitely start to slide up out of that hole. And this is really when you catch them right on the edge of that depth change. This is a great time to target trout post front, right on the edges of those grass flats. Just because that's, prime opportunity for them to feed. Trouts or ambush predators, eyes on the top of their head, camouflage on their backs. They come up from below on bait. So that bait that's starting to move around a little bit more, the trout slide up right to the edges of those grass flats. And as that bait kind of hangs off the edge or starts swimming over the edge of that depth change, those trout just come right up from below and grab it. So basically all I'm doing this time is just rolling some paddle tails right over the edges of these cuts. I will a lot of times wade or kayak right parallel to these edges and these depth changes and just make really long casts. And it's really important to have polarized sunglasses so that you can actually see these cuts, or you can actually see that depth change. Now, if you're in the Carolinas or coastal marshes where it's a little bit more difficult to see that depth change, I do recommend that you tie on a heavier jig head so that you can feel the bottom and just notice how long it takes for you as you're kind of twitch pausing or you're working your bait, how much longer it takes for it to get to the bottom, and really kind of feel out where that depth change is. Or if you have a fish finder or a depth finder, find out where that depth change is and really try to work it. In murky water, it is super important that you put your bait exactly where it needs to be. And those fish, even the reds, will slide up to those depth changes as well. They'll hang right on that shelf. And that's where I find a lot of them feeding. And that's just kind of with the gradual change. And I'll talk again about the more sudden change in warmth here in a second, but I'll let Tony cover this more gradual post-front scenario first.
Yeah, that gradual change, that's going to be, as we're deeper into winter and we start getting into spring, that's when temperatures sort of stabilize a little bit better. So the more we have cold fronts come through, it's actually the less the temperature is going to change, because it's really those first few cold fronts that come through, late fall and early winter. That's when there's usually going to be a drastic change in water temperature. This year, I believe I saw the temperature change 10 or 15 degrees in just a couple days. It went from about 85 all the way down to 70, 71, 72. And that drastic change definitely shocks the fish a bit, and they're going to hunker down. But as we get later into the winter and into spring, those temperature changes aren't as drastic because the temperature stabilizes. And as we get into spring, the temperatures gradually start warming up. They might warm up a little bit, then back down a little bit, then warm up more, back down. So the end of winter, you're really going to get those very short changes in temperature, and that's when the fish can really be the most active, in my opinion, because it really comes down to how drastic that change in temperature is.
No, yeah, that's definitely a great point. How would you say it differs? Because what I was about to dive into was post front when there's that really sudden change and it starts getting really warm. So you're saying that you would prefer that more slight gradual change of warmth to a sudden just burst of warmth back from a really harsh cold front. Would you mind elaborating on that?
Yeah, so I didn't really see much of a difference in fish activity just recently over here. It was pretty cold one week and then it warmed up. It was like in the 80s, mid 70s and low 80s. And then it dropped back down to like the 30s overnight. Like right now, it's super windy, 30s overnight. And that big burst of warm weather, I didn't really see too much of a difference in the fish's behavior. It still held the same. They were sitting shallow, or they were sitting deep rather, early in the morning, and then middle of the afternoon, they were up shallow cruising around looking for food. If anything, they'll probably be more active in the afternoon when you have that big temperature change to a warmer temperature, as opposed to later in the afternoon where it's still pretty cool out, if that makes sense. Now, you may not see more fish up shallow, but they may be more willing to cooperate than if you have a real burst of cold air or something like that.
Gotcha. Yeah, I would say one thing that I definitely see when it does really warm up quickly after a really harsh front is that the amount of cloud cover outside can really affect fish activity as well. If there's a lot of sunlight that is warming those shallows, I do see fish slide up. Again, this is, as you said, as it gets later on in the day and that temperature has warmed up the water a little bit more. First thing in the morning, if it is, bright and sunny, I don't see too much of an effect. I do agree they still sit pretty shallow, or they'll sit on that edge a little bit deeper. But, around that 12, 1, 2 o'clock range, I'm seeing the majority of fish up like in that 100-yard range that we talked about earlier on. I do see them slide up a little bit shallower. They'll go sit in the potholes. They'll get close to those oyster bars, and they'll slide up in those areas looking for an easy meal. And again, they do have a little bit more energy than they did during the front. But I wouldn't necessarily say the level of energy pre-front that I saw.
And also the different species can vary. If you have a really good warming trend, I noticed I started seeing a lot more trout pushing up and a lot more snook pushing up, as opposed to redfish. Redfish seem to push up no matter what later in the day. But when we had that really good warming trend, started seeing some different species start to show up in the shallows.
Yeah, no, I would definitely agree with that. I mean, it goes back to the biology of the fish that we're targeting. It's always really important to know how those fish are feeding, where those feeding opportunities are. And it just seems like in the wintertime, those reds are pushing shallow beats so they can get access to those crabs, those shrimp. And, you even see black drum doing it. I was out not too long ago and saw some 30-inch black drum tailing in like 4 inches of water. So those drum species that primarily are bottom feeders, they're getting up to have access to those crabs and snails and other small crustaceans that are up in those shallows. But yeah, I would say, I would agree with that. We don't have any snook here. I mean, from what I've heard, there's not too many here in Texas. But I do see that same trend with the trout. They'll kind of slide up a little bit more, after a couple more days of warmth. The redfish usually are going to be there anyway.
Yeah. And I like what you said about the black drum. Down here in Florida, this time of year, that's like prime time to find big schools of black drum on the flats. And that can be a great alternative to going after, your regular redfish, snook, and sea trout over here. Is go look for some black drum on the flats. And my favorite lure for them is a gulp shrimp on a jig head. That's probably my number one artificial for that. If not, bring some, frozen shrimp or dead shrimp along with you on a trip, just in case you happen to come across those fish.
So would you mind breaking down let's say you're going over a flat, you're kind of close to one of those depth changes, you're scooting by in the shallows and you see one of those big black drum, they're tailing over there. You've got your gulp shrimp rigged up. What are you doing to catch that fish?
So usually if you start seeing one, you're going to start seeing more and more, and then eventually you'll find the school. When I find those fish, I'm looking for water moving around. It's kind of funny because these fish can sit, 30-pound fish sitting in 2 feet of water, and you had no idea they were there until you run them over, and then the water just explodes. I have some videos actually showing that. But when I do find these fish, I want to figure out where they're at. Once I find them, I want to make sure they're settled down. If they're spooked and they're taking off, they're going different directions, the school is taking off, it's going to be hard to catch them. So you want to wait till they settle down. They usually don't spook off very far. They'll usually, take off, a big wake will go out, and then the wake will just stop, and they'll just sit there, start swimming in circles, and they'll get comfortable again. And once they do, that's when I'll just toss a gulp shrimp out. Usually they'll be swimming around in circles or slowly moving one way. Cast it out in front of wherever they're going, and then just raise your rod tip and slowly drag it. Wait for them to get close, slowly drag that gulp shrimp. If not, just let it sit there and the other fish will bump into your line, and that will make that gulp shrimp move pretty much by itself. And usually a fish will pick it up. And if you are sight casting like single fish, same thing. Just see where that fish is going, throw your lure far enough in front of it that, it'll cross paths with that fish, and then just slowly move it to get that fish's attention.
So you're kind of taking a few seconds to really see the pattern of where that fish is moving. I know a lot of guys, and I'm guilty of this as well. Sometimes I'll see a fish and it's like, boom, cast, got to whip one off right immediately. And so you're sitting there actually seeing, for a couple seconds where that fish is headed to really calculate the trajectory. You're doing some calculations in your head where that fish is going to be so that it intercepts your bait already on the bottom of the ground. So that I think that sounds like a pretty good formula to catch some black drum.
Yeah, and it's very similar too for redfish. sea trout, snook in the wintertime, sight fishing is really good because like we've said, later in the day, those fish will push up shallow to warm up. And usually in the wintertime, most of the water in my area and all around the coast is going to clear up just because we don't have as much rainfall, not as much runoff, water's a little cleaner. And just sitting there and watching the fish is going to help you catch more fish, because you can analyze their behavior, see what they're doing. If they take off really fast and they don't slow down, there's a good chance you're not going to be able to catch that fish. If it darts away and then it slows, you see the wake slow down maybe 15, 20 feet away, and then that fish stops or circles back towards you, there's usually a good chance you'll catch that fish. So just some extra tips there on sight fishing in the wintertime as well.
Awesome. Well, we've just about covered everything that I had in my notes for today. Guys, overarching key themes to keep in mind: look for those depth changes that are wind protected and are close to structure. That's really your number one spot. And then really pick how you're going to fish that area based on what the weather's been doing and what it's doing that day. So it's really important to look at the last week of weather before you head out. Make sure you have your pre-plan ready, know where those fish are going to be so you're not wasting time. Have that area picked out and know how you're going to fish it based on what the weather patterns are going to dictate those fish to do. Again, they're cold-blooded. They're subject to the elements. They don't get to go up shallow if they feel like it. They're not like us. They're not warm-blooded. So they are going to be subject to the elements, and you can really dial in on what they're doing by understanding how these winter weather patterns are going to affect fish. And if you would like to see all of the stuff we've talked about put to practice in live action on the water, me and Tony are going out every single week making these reports, also spot the sections, breaking down the areas that you guys are fishing. We actually take requests from members to break down their spots with the exact same level of detail that we did today. We do that every single week in the Salt Strong Insider Club. And on top of all of that, you are saving up to 20% on some of the best tackle in the saltwater fishing industry. So just really every reason you need as an angler to join the Insider Club. You're saving money on tackle and you're becoming a better fisherman. And we offer a 200% guarantee. So if you tried the club for a year, you feel like it did not help you catch fish, which I don't know how that could even happen, we give you your money back plus the cost of the membership itself. So looking forward to seeing you guys in the Insider Club. Tony, thank you so much again for coming on, and we'll see you guys in the next tip.
Take care, guys.
'Cause fishing, it's in my soul. It was passed down to me from the days of old. Find us on the water if there was a way. It's been said my papa, he wrote the book on catching big reds and 20-pound snook. I wish I knew all the things he knew today. For he's the reason why we are this way. And he put fishing in our souls to stay.